A salty wind whips through a crowded medieval harbor. Massive wooden ships rock gently in the water, their hulls packed with furs, wax, and barrels of silver. Merchants from a dozen lands haggle in a dozen languages over the price of salt, cloth, and timber. This is the world the Hanseatic League built, yet its story is one of history's greatest puzzles. How did a simple pact between a few German towns explode into a commercial empire that commanded the economy of an entire continent? For centuries, this merchant network controlled trade from the bustling docks of London to the frozen rivers of Novgorod. Then it simply faded away, leaving behind ghostly trading posts and a legacy of secrets. By the end of this story, you will understand the true power behind this medieval superpower and the hidden reasons for its mysterious disappearance. What force could possibly dismantle an institution that once held kings in its debt? How does an entire way of life simply vanish from the world stage? What does the rise and fall of these merchant kings tell us about the fragile nature of our own interconnected world? Northern Europe in the 1200s was a world shattered into 1,000 pieces. The great empires of old were fading memories, replaced by a patchwork of feuding local lords and isolated towns. Traveling just a few dozen miles meant crossing into a new territory, each with its own ruler demanding a heavy toll for passage. The seas, once dominated by Viking longships, were now the hunting grounds of pirates who preyed on any vessel bold enough to carry valuable cargo. For a merchant, a simple journey to sell cloth or buy grain was a gamble with life and fortune. You could be robbed by bandits on land, captured by pirates at sea, or bankrupted by a nobleman who decided your goods were now his. Trade was not a profession for the faint of heart. It was a desperate, small-scale affair, confined to local markets and trusted neighbors. Why would anyone risk everything to transport goods across such a dangerous and fragmented landscape? This very chaos, however, created a vacuum. It was a world desperately in need of order, stability, and safe passage. From the ashes of this fractured system, the perfect conditions were forming for a revolutionary idea to take root. What if merchants stopped competing as rivals and started cooperating as a single, unstoppable force? Into this fractured world stepped a man with a blueprint. Count Adolf II of Holstein did not simply found a town in 1143. He planted a seed in the swampy soils of the Trav River, a seed that would grow into the mighty city of Lübeck. His vision was radical for its time. This was not another fortified castle or a haphazard village. Lübeck was conceived from the ground up as a commercial machine, a planned hub designed to dominate trade. Its location was its genius, positioned on a narrow isthmus with perfect access to both the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. A merchant ship could unload precious goods from the east and have them portaged a short distance overland to reach Western markets, completely bypassing the long, treacherous sea journey around the Jutland Peninsula. But a city is more than just its geography. It is a magnet for people, so who were the first to answer the call? They were not knights or nobles, but pragmatic, ambitious merchants from places like Bremen and Westphalia. These were men who could see past the mud and the timber scaffolds. They saw a gateway. They saw a chance to create a new kind of power, one built not on swords and land, but on contracts, cargo, and silver coins. They were the true architects of Lübeck's destiny, transforming a strategic outpost into a bustling hive of commerce within a single generation. This swampy settlement was quickly crowned the Queen of the Hanse, a title earned not by royal decree, but by the sheer force of collective ambition. So what was the secret ingredient that turned this one city into the beating heart of a future empire? It was the revolutionary idea that cooperation could be a far greater weapon than competition. This collective ambition needed its first real test, and it came not from a rival merchant but from a prince. The city of Novgorod, far to the east, was a legendary trading post, a gateway to the vast forests of Russia and their unimaginable wealth in furs, wax, and golden honey. For any German merchant, gaining entry was the ultimate prize. Yet the Prince of Novgorod was a powerful and distant ruler, under no obligation to open his doors. The merchants of Lübeck did not send an army, they sent a delegation, and they did not ask for a favor. They negotiated a privilege. This was the Hanseatic League's first masterstroke. The treaty they secured was a revolution written on parchment. It granted the German merchants their own enclosed trading post, a contour within Novgorod's walls. Here they could live by their own laws, judge their own disputes, and store their goods in safety. In return, the prince received a guarantee of high-quality goods and a steady, reliable flow of silver into his coffers. It was a deal built on mutual benefit, but the real power lay in the terms. For the first time, a scattered group of merchants had bargained as a single entity with a foreign power and won. They had turned their collective economic weight into a political tool. This was the template. The agreement with Novgorod proved that a unified front of traders could unlock any door. The promise of consistent trade and premium goods was a lure that few rulers could resist. One by one, other ports saw the advantage. In England, the League would later secure similar privileges in London, and in the Scandinavian kingdoms their influence grew. Each new treaty was another thread in a growing web, a web that was slowly but surely binding the economies of Northern Europe together. But how do you protect such a vast and valuable network when it spans stormy seas and pirate-infested waters? The answer would require more than just signed documents. It would demand a show of force. The ink on their treaties was dry, but parchment alone could not build an empire. Its true foundation was cargo. The wealth of the Hanseatic League was not measured in abstract numbers, but in the tangible, often pungent, goods that filled the holds of its ships. Think of a cog sailing from the Baltic to London. Its deck is stacked high with sturdy wooden barrels. Some are packed with pristine white salt, a treasure mine from the deep pits of Lübeck. This was not table salt for seasoning. This was industrial salt, the lifeblood of a booming food industry. In the ports of Scandinavia, countless herring were pulled from the cold northern seas. Without salt, these fish would rot within days. With it, they could be preserved for months, shipped across Europe, and fed to millions. The salt from one German town and the fish from northern seas created a single, continent-spanning supply chain. Then there were the furs. In the dark, frozen forests of Russia and Scandinavia, hunters tracked sable, marten, and fox. A single winter pelt from these animals was worth a small fortune to a nobleman in London or Bruges, a dazzling symbol of status and wealth. But the Hanseatic trade was not just about luxury, it was about necessity. The same forests that provided furs also yielded massive trunks of timber, essential for building the very ships that carried these goods and for constructing the growing cities of a deforested Western Europe. And from the earth itself came silver and copper, mined from the mountains of Germany. This metal was hammered into coins, the hard currency that oiled the gears of this entire commercial machine. Each of these commodities tells a story of deep interdependence. The fine woolen cloth produced on the looms of Flanders could not exist without the grease and lanolin from sheep, which often came from English pastures. That English wool, in turn, was often purchased with Hanseatic silver. It was a closed loop, a self-sustaining economic ecosystem. The League did not just transport goods. It connected disparate worlds. A Russian forester, a German miner, a Flemish weaver, and a Scandinavian fisherman, all utterly unaware of each other, were bound together by the invisible threads of Hanseatic commerce. Their collective labor, organized and protected by the League, created a standard of living and a flow of wealth that Europe had not seen since the fall of Rome. But what happened when someone tried to cut these threads? When a king or a rival city decided to challenge this merchant network's dominance? the League's response was swift, brutal, and utterly decisive. The true muscle of this commercial empire was not a king or an army, but a ship. The Hanseatic cog was a floating fortress of trade, a vessel so perfectly designed for its purpose that it became the container ship of the Middle Ages. Picture a high-sided, tub-shaped hull built from overlapping oak planks, a technique known as clinker building. This method created an incredibly strong yet flexible skeleton that could withstand the brutal pounding of North Sea storms. At its center stood a single, massive square sail, a vast sheet of canvas that could harness the wind to drive the ship across vast distances. But the cog's true genius was its cavernous belly. Unlike the sleek, shallow Viking longships that came before it, the cog was all about capacity. Its broad beam and flat bottom allowed for a staggering volume of cargo. A single cog could carry the equivalent of 200 horses worth of goods, all securely stored below a watertight deck that protected the precious contents from the elements. This was a revolutionary advance. Before the cog, maritime trade was a seasonal, small-scale gamble. The cog turned it into a predictable, large-scale enterprise. It was the reliable workhorse that could leave Lübeck laden with salt and cloth, brave the open sea, and arrive in Bergen or London weeks later with its cargo dry and its value intact. These ships did not sail alone. They moved in fleets following established seasonal routes, creating a predictable rhythm of commerce that the northern world came to depend on. The silver, the furs, the wax, and the cloth that fueled economies all traveled in the deep, dark holds of these unassuming wooden vessels. They were the pulsating arteries of the Hanseatic League, and without their relentless, reliable journey, the entire body of the network would have withered. But even the sturdiest ship needs a safe harbor, and the League's greatest strength was also its most glaring vulnerability. How do you protect a fortune that is constantly at sea? This network of ships and treaties needed a permanent foothold in the west, and they found it on the very banks of the Thames. In the heart of London, a stone's throw from the bustling city, stood a walled compound that was German territory in all but name. They called it the Steelyard. Picture a fortified island, a world unto itself, bristling with warehouses, guarded gates, and its own massive scales for weighing goods. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wax and timber, and the conversations were in Low German. The merchants who lived and worked here enjoyed extraordinary privileges granted by royal charter. They were exempt from the heavy taxes that burdened English merchants. They could be judged only by their own officials, following their own strict commercial laws. This autonomy made them incredibly efficient and, to the English crown, incredibly valuable. The Steelyard was the indispensable funnel through which the naval supplies England desperately needed, like timber and tar, flowed into the kingdom. In return, the Hanseatic merchants exported England's most prized commodity, its high-quality wool, to the weavers of Flanders. It was a symbiotic relationship, a deal that made the Hanseatic merchants essential partners in England's own economy. Yet this very success sowed the seeds of bitter resentment. How could English traders compete with a rival operating from a tax-free enclave in their own capital? The sight of these foreign merchants growing wealthy, living under their own rules behind their own high walls, was a constant, galling provocation. The Steelyard was both the ultimate symbol of the League's power and its greatest point of vulnerability. It was a fortress of commerce, but even the strongest walls cannot hold back the tides of envy and national ambition forever. Yet the League's power was not confined to the wharves of London. Far to the south, in the rich lowlands of Flanders, the Hanseatic network plugged into the very heart of European finance. The city of Bruges was the Wall Street of its age, a buzzing hive of commerce where the raw wealth of the East met the sophisticated machinery of Western capital. The Hanseatic contour here was not a fortified compound like the Steelyard, but a row of elegant guild halls lining a busy canal. The air here smelled not of salt and fish, but of ink, parchment, and minted coins. This was where the real alchemy happened. A merchant arriving from Novgorod with a hold full of furs did not simply barter them for cloth. He would sell his cargo to a local agent for letters of credit, intricate paper promises that could be redeemed for cash in Venice, Cologne, or Paris. He could deposit his silver in a fledgling bank, take out a loan to finance his next voyage, or insure his ship against the perils of the sea. Bruges was the League's financial command center. Its annual fairs were the medieval equivalent of a modern global stock exchange, setting prices for everything from English wool to Russian wax for the entire continent. Here, the Hanseatic merchants performed their most vital role. They were the indispensable middlemen, the critical conduit in a vast economic circuit. They channeled the raw materials of the vast, undeveloped East, the timber, furs, and wax, into the sophisticated workshops and hungry markets of the West. In return, they carried back the manufactured goods the East craved: fine Flemish cloth, intricate metalwork, and exotic spices from the Mediterranean. By controlling this flow, the Hanseatic League did more than just make a profit. It became the central nervous system of the entire Northern European economy. Its decisions in Bruges could determine the price of a knight's cloak in France or a barrel of herring in Norway. But this very centrality created a paradox. The League's success now depended on the stability and cooperation of the very foreign powers it had once dominated. What happens when those powers finally decide they no longer need a middleman? While the merchants in Bruges navigated the world of high finance, their counterparts in the far eastern outpost of Novgorod lived under a completely different set of rules. Isolated in their fortified compound known as St. Peter's Yard, these men were governed by a document of immense power and peculiarity, the Novgorod Skra. This was not a suggestion, but a sacred legal code, a survival manual for a colony of foreigners operating in a land that could be both alien and hostile. The Skra's first and most fundamental rule was a complete ban on fraternization. A Hanseatic merchant was forbidden from living with a Russian, from sharing a meal with one, or even from employing a Russian servant within the walls of the contor. He could not learn the local language beyond the bare essentials needed for trade. These rules were not born from prejudice, but from a cold, hard calculation of risk. In a world without formal embassies, the slightest personal dispute could escalate into a diplomatic crisis, jeopardizing the entire trading operation. The merchants had to present a united, impenetrable front, a single corporate entity that could not be manipulated or divided from within. This discipline extended into every corner of their lives. They slept in shared dormitories, ate at common tables, and their every movement in and out of the compound was meticulously logged. Even their social lives were regulated, with strict limits on how much beer and wine they could consume each day. A merchant caught drunk could face a heavy fine. Why such extreme control? Because in Novgorod, the Hanseatic League was not just a business, it was a fortress under constant, invisible siege. The wealth stored within St. Peter's Yard, the piles of furs and barrels of wax, was an irresistible temptation. The Skra was the wall that protected that treasure, not from invading armies, but from the slow erosion of trust, the careless mistake, or the drunken boast that could unravel decades of careful negotiation. It was a system that traded personal freedom for collective security, creating a band of merchant monks whose unwavering discipline allowed them to prosper in a world that never truly wanted them there. But what happened when this rigid, self-imposed order was challenged not from within, but by an external force it could not control? King Valdemar IV of Denmark saw the Hanseatic League not as a partner, but as a rival to be crushed. He was a monarch of immense ambition, watching with growing fury as a parade of foreign cogs sailed through his waters, growing unimaginably wealthy from trade that he did not fully control. His kingdom held the keys to the Baltic, and he decided it was time to charge a king's ransom for passage. He imposed heavy tolls on all ships passing through the narrow sound between Denmark and Sweden. When Hanseatic captains protested, his warships seized their vessels and cargo. This was no longer simple piracy. It was a direct, calculated assault by a crowned head of state. Valdemar was not just raising revenue. He was attempting to strangle the League in its cradle, to reclaim the wealth of the northern seas for the Danish crown alone. For the first time, the merchants faced an enemy that could not be out-negotiated with a trade treaty or managed with the strict rules of a contour. This was an existential threat. The very waterways that were the lifeblood of their network were being systematically blockaded. How do you reason with a king who wants your entire business? The loose alliance of merchant towns now faced a terrible choice. They could submit, pay the tolls, and see their hard-won profits evaporate, or they could do the unthinkable. They could go to war. The city halls of Lübeck, Hamburg, and Cologne buzzed with frantic debate. These were men of commerce, of balance sheets and cargo manifests. They were not soldiers. The idea of raising an army, of funding a fleet of warships to challenge a king, was a terrifying and alien concept, but Valdemar had left them no other path. Their cooperation, which had once been purely economic, was about to be forged in the fire of conflict. The merchant alliance was about to become a military power. The merchant ledgers were closed and the war chests were opened. A profound transformation swept through the Hanseatic cities, a shift from counting coins to counting warships. Lübeck took the lead, its city councillors, men more accustomed to debating tariffs than tactics, now authorizing the construction of a dedicated war fleet. The funds were raised through a massive, coordinated loan from the combined treasuries of the allied towns. This was not a king's war funded by taxes on peasants. This was a corporation's war financed by the pooled capital of its shareholders. The cogs that had once carried salt and cloth were retrofitted with towering wooden castles fore and aft, turning their decks into floating archery platforms. The men chosen to command these vessels were not grizzled knights, but respected merchants and senior burghers. One such man was Johann Wittenborg, the burgomaster of Lübeck himself. His authority came not from a noble title, but from his proven skill in managing complex logistics and vast resources. He was a chief executive officer handed the sword of an admiral. The initial clashes were brutal tests of this new model. A Hanseatic flotilla intercepted a Danish squadron, and the air filled with the screams of men and the snap of bowstrings. The merchants and sailors, fighting to protect their very livelihood, discovered a ferocity that perhaps surprised even themselves. They were defending more than cargo. They were defending a system, a way of life that Valdemar threatened to erase. Yet these were still amateur forces facing a professional navy. In one early, disastrous engagement, a Hanseatic fleet was caught off guard and shattered, its ships captured or sent to the bottom. The defeat was a sobering lesson. It proved that commercial discipline alone could not guarantee victory on the open sea. The League had the money and the will, but it needed a new kind of strategy, one that could leverage its unique strengths while countering the king's military advantage. How could a decentralized network of merchants possibly outmaneuver a unified monarchy with a single, decisive chain of command? The answer would require them to become something they had never been before, not just defenders but conquerors. The war reached its climax not with a final, cataclysmic battle, but with a fleet so vast it blackened the horizon. The Hanseatic cities had learned their painful lesson from earlier defeats. They pooled their resources on an unimaginable scale, assembling an armada of over 35 warships and thousands of men. This was no longer a flotilla of armed merchants. It was the navy of a sovereign power, and it sailed directly for the heart of the Danish kingdom. They laid siege to Copenhagen itself, and then, with the Danish fleet trapped in port, they systematically captured the kingdom's most vital fortresses one by one. King Valdemar was forced to watch as the very foundations of his power were dismantled by an enemy that had no king, no crown, and no royal bloodline. His military was broken, his treasury was empty, and his options had run out. In 1370, he was compelled to sign one of the most humiliating and revolutionary peace treaties in medieval history. The document signed in the city of Stralsund was not a simple ceasefire. It was a merchant's peace, a complete rewriting of the rules of power. The League's demands were breathtaking in their scope. First, they secured what they had originally fought for, the permanent right of free passage through the Sound, forever removing the Danish crown's ability to tax their lifeblood. But they went much, much further. They demanded and received an absolute monopoly on the lucrative trade of Scania herring. This was not just a trade deal. It was corporate control over the most important food source in Northern Europe. The most astonishing clause, however, was one that echoed through every royal court on the continent. For a period of 15 years, the Hanseatic League was granted the right to veto the succession of the Danish monarchy. No new king could ascend the throne without the explicit approval of the merchant councils in Lübeck and her sister cities. Imagine a modern corporation having the legal authority to approve or reject the next president of a major nation. It was an almost unthinkable transfer of political sovereignty. The Treaty of Stralsund marked the absolute zenith of Hanseatic power. They were no longer just a lobbying group or a trading bloc. They had defeated a kingdom and dictated terms that subordinated a crown to their commercial interest. They had become, in every meaningful sense, a state without borders, an empire of commerce that could bend kings to its will. But such absolute power creates its own unique burdens. How do you manage an empire when your headquarters is not a palace but a conference room? When your army is a temporary alliance and your unity is tested not by war but by the slow, grinding pressures of peace and profit? The sheer power displayed at Stralsund masked a deep and fundamental weakness. How do you govern an empire without an emperor? The Hanseatic League was a ghost in the political machine of Europe. It had no permanent army, no central treasury, and no single leader who could issue a command. Its true structure was a web of shifting alliances, held together by one thing above all else: mutual profit. At its core, the League was simply a network of independent cities, each with its own local government and its own parochial concerns. They were bound not by a written constitution, but by a shared understanding that their collective strength far exceeded their individual power. When a crisis loomed, like the war with Denmark, these cities would come together in a gathering known as a diet. Picture a great hall in Lübeck, filled not with robed princes, but with pragmatic merchants and town councillors from dozens of ports. There were no kings here, only delegates arguing, negotiating, and calculating. These diets were chaotic, often frustrating affairs. Decisions were not made by majority vote, but by consensus. Every city, from the mighty Lübeck to the smallest Baltic port, had to be persuaded that a course of action served its own economic interest. If a decision threatened to harm one city's trade while benefiting another's, it would simply be blocked. This was a system built on voluntary cooperation, and it moved at the speed of the slowest, most cautious member. Within this loose federation, a clear hierarchy emerged. The so-called Wendish cities, led by the undisputed queen, Lübeck, formed the League's executive brain trust. Lübeck's wealth, its fleet, and its strategic position made it the natural agenda setter. When a pirate needed to be hunted down or a king needed to be confronted, it was almost always Lübeck that sent the first letters, convened the diet, and committed the most resources. Hamburg, with its access to the North Sea, was its crucial partner. Together, these leading cities formed a directorate of commerce. They were the ones who enforced the collective decisions, often by imposing trade embargoes, known as a Verhandsung, on any city or ruler that defied the League's will. To be placed under this ban was an economic death sentence, cutting a port off from the entire Hanseatic trading network. This was the League's ultimate weapon, a financial siege more feared than any army. It was a system of governance perfectly suited to merchants, flexible, pragmatic, and ruthlessly focused on the bottom line. But this very flexibility was also its fatal flaw. What holds an alliance together when the profits begin to dry up and the collective interest fractures into 100 competing selfish desires? The Grand Hall in Lübeck's town hall was a theater of power, but no crowns were in sight. Instead, the air hummed with the low murmur of Low German, the shared language of commerce, as delegates from dozens of cities took their places. This was the Hanseatic Diet, a parliament of merchants where the fate of Northern Europe was bartered and sold. The men gathered here were not nobles, they were burgomasters, councillors, and senior guildsmen, their authority measured in cargo manifests and silver marks. They had journeyed from as far west as London and as far east as Novgorod, their cloaks still smelling of salt and the sea, to resolve disputes that kings could not. The agenda was a merchant's ledger of crises and opportunities. Should the League impose a trade embargo on a Norwegian port that had raised its tariffs, how should they respond to the latest pirate attacks in the North Sea? Could they standardize the complex system of weights and measures used from Bruges to Bergen? Each question was a thread in the vast tapestry of their collective enterprise, and a single snapped thread could unravel fortunes. Decisions were not made by decree, but through exhausting, meticulous negotiation. A delegate from Cologne might argue passionately for a unified trade war against the King of England, while a representative from Danzig would caution that such a move would endanger their own vital timber exports. There were no yay or nay votes. Every policy required consensus, a unanimous agreement forged from a cacophony of competing self-interests. The process was slow, often frustrating, a stark contrast to the swift commands of a monarch. Yet this was the League's genius and its greatest vulnerability. For an agreement reached this way after days of debate over wine and roasted meats was built on a foundation of solid self-interest. When the Diet finally issued a decree, it carried the weight of a collective threat more potent than any royal army. To defy the will of this hall was to face the Verhansung, a total trade ban that could strangle a city's economy within a single shipping season. This was the true power in the room, not the power of the sword, but the power of the market, wielded by a council of shopkeepers who had learned to command kings. But how long could such a fragile web of consensus hold when new empires began to rise from the shadows? A merchant's power is measured in more than just silver and ships. It is etched into the very stone of the cities they built. Walk through the old town of Tallinn, Lübeck, or Bergen, and you are walking through a Hanseatic landscape, a world defined by a unique and imposing architectural style known as brick Gothic. Forget the soaring, delicate spires of French cathedrals. This was a style built for commerce and defense. Its signature was the deep red brick, a material born from the clay-rich soil of the northern plains, fired in massive kilns and laid with geometric precision. These were not the palaces of kings, but the warehouses, town halls, and churches of merchants. Their grandeur was a statement of civic pride and financial might. Look up at the stepped gables of a Hanseatic warehouse, a facade that resembles a massive crown. This was not mere decoration. That distinctive shape allowed for a massive, sturdy attic, perfect for storing heavy bales of cloth or barrels of grain, while the narrow, high windows maximized wall space for shelving and minimized the risk of fire. The churches, funded by merchant guilds, reached for the heavens with stout, powerful bell towers that also served as lighthouses and watchtowers. This was an architecture of pragmatism and profit, a physical manifestation of the Hanseatic mind, where every brick had to serve a purpose and beauty was found in formidable utility. But how do you conduct business across 1,000 miles if you cannot understand the man you are trading with? The answer was carried on every cog and echoed in every contour. Middle Low German was the secret language of this commercial empire. It was not the language of poets or princes, but the gritty, practical tongue of the North Sea coast. In the bustling ports from London to Novgorod, This dialect became the lingua franca of commerce, the English of its day. A Dutch merchant and a Russian boyar might not share a native tongue, but they could haggle over the price of wax or negotiate a shipping contract in their common second language, Middle Low German. Its influence seeped into the vocabularies of countless other languages. The English words for dock, skipper, and freight are all Hanseatic loans, permanent echoes of this mercantile tongue. This shared language did more than just ease transactions. It created a common identity, a sense of being part of a vast, interconnected world that transcended local loyalties. It was the verbal glue that held the network together, and what governed this world, beyond the walls and the words, lay a more subtle export, Hanseatic law. The League did not impose its rules by conquest, but by convenience. Their sophisticated commercial codes, covering everything from maritime insurance to debt collection, became the gold standard for business across Northern Europe. A legal dispute between a merchant from Bruges and a shipmaster from Danzig could be settled using a recognized set of Hanseatic ordinances, ensuring fairness and predictability. They pioneered concepts like the power of attorney, allowing a merchant to appoint a representative in a distant city to act on his behalf. This web of trusted legal practices reduced the terrifying uncertainty of medieval trade, turning a handshake across a sea into a binding contract. Together, the brick cities, the common tongue, and the standardized laws forged something remarkable, a unified cultural zone that stretched across national boundaries. A merchant could travel from the Steelyard in London to St. Peter's Yard in Novgorod and find a familiar world, a landscape built on shared principles of commerce, communication, and order. This cultural footprint was the League's most enduring legacy, the ghost in the machine of modern Europe. But even the most solid brick can crumble, and the most common language can fall silent. What force could possibly dismantle a world so deeply entrenched? The very treaty that had secured the Hanseatic League's power in London became the weapon used against them. For centuries, the merchants of the Steelyard had operated as a state within a state, enjoying tax exemptions and legal autonomy that made them untouchable competitors. But the England of the 14th and 15th centuries was changing. It was no longer a fragmented kingdom reliant on foreign middlemen, but a nation coalescing under a strong monarchy with its own ambitious merchant class. These English traders looked upon the walled compound on the Thames with burning resentment. How could they thrive when their rivals paid no duties and answered to no local law? Their grievances found a powerful voice in Parliament, which began to echo with a new and dangerous idea: economic nationalism. The English crown, once a partner, now saw an opportunity. By empowering its own merchants and stripping the Hanse of its privileges, it could keep more of the trade wealth within the kingdom. The first major rupture came with the Naval Patrol Act of 1449, a law designed to promote English shipping at the direct expense of Hanseatic cogs. Suddenly, the League's ships found themselves harassed, their cargoes subject to new, punitive inspections. The Hanse responded as it always had, with a declaration of a trade embargo, a Verhandsung, against England. But this time, the old magic was fading. The English economy was robust enough to withstand the pressure, and English merchants were eager to fill the void. They began sending their own ships directly into the Baltic, bypassing the Hanseatic middlemen entirely to buy timber and furs. It was a direct challenge to the League's core business model. Skirmishes turned into a full-blown trade war. Hanseatic ships were seized by English privateers in the Channel, and the League's vessels retaliated in kind. The conflict culminated in a shocking English raid on the Hanseatic fleet in the neutral Dutch port of Vliestruum, where dozens of cogs were burned. This was not a battle against a lone king like Valdemar. It was a fight against the rising tide of an entire nation. The subsequent peace treaties were no longer victories for the League, but a series of gradual, humiliating retreats. Their cherished privileges in London were slowly chipped away, their monopoly on the English wool trade broken. Each new treaty saw their walls shrink a little more, their influence wane. The Steelyard, once the impregnable fortress of their western power, had become a gilded cage, its inhabitants living on borrowed time. The English challenge proved a devastating truth that the League's greatest strength, its control over the flow of goods, was also its ultimate weakness. For once its trading partners developed their own ships and their own ambitions, the indispensable middleman became expendable. And if England could defy the merchant kings, what was to stop others from following suit? While the Hanseatic League was fighting a rearguard action against England, a far more dangerous rival was rising from the coastal marshes of the Low Countries. The Dutch did not just compete with the Hanseatic model, they rendered it obsolete. Their weapon was a new kind of ship, the Flight. Where the Hanseatic cog was a sturdy, multi-purpose vessel, the Flight was a masterpiece of minimalist efficiency. Its design was brutally pragmatic, with a pear-shaped hull that maximized cargo space while minimizing the crew needed to sail it. A Flight could be operated by perhaps 10 men, while a Hanseatic cog of similar size required 30. This was not a ship built for war or even for versatility. It was a floating warehouse, a machine designed for one thing only: to transport goods as cheaply as humanly possible. The Dutch had stripped away every ounce of unnecessary cost, and in doing so, they broke the Hanseatic monopoly on affordable shipping. The League's strength had always been its control over the journey, but the Dutch now offered a cheaper, faster ride. How could the Hanseatic cities, each protecting its own shipbuilding guilds and traditional methods, possibly keep up with such a radical innovation? Their very structure, a loose alliance of independent interests, prevented the kind of unified, systemic change the Dutch had embraced. This shipping revolution was paired with an aggressive new trade policy. The Dutch merchants were not content to operate through middlemen in established contours. They sailed directly to the source, sending their flights deep into the Baltic to load up with Polish grain and Russian timber, cutting out the Hanseatic merchants who had controlled that flow for centuries. They even dared to sail directly to Novgorod, the League's own eastern stronghold, and negotiated their own deals. The Hanseatic response was not innovation, but a desperate attempt to enforce the old rules. They imposed blockades and tried to strong-arm the Dutch into submission, just as they had with King Valdemar. This escalation led to the Dutch-Hanseatic War, a conflict that would expose the League's fatal rigidities. The Hanse assembled a fleet, but it was a patchwork force of ships from different cities, each with its own priorities and limited commitment. The Dutch, by contrast, were unified and fiercely motivated. In a series of engagements, the lighter, more numerous Dutch vessels outmaneuvered the heavier Hanseatic cogs. The war culminated in a decisive Dutch victory, forcing the Hanseatic League to sign a treaty that formally recognized the right of Dutch ships to trade freely in the Baltic. This was more than a military defeat, it was a symbolic surrender. The League's control over the sea lanes, the very foundation of its power, had been broken by a competitor that was faster, cheaper, and utterly unimpressed by their historical dominance. The age of the privileged trading network was ending, and the age of open, competitive commerce had begun. A ghost ship drifted into the harbor of Lübeck, its decks silent and its sails tattered. When a boarding party finally mustered the courage to climb aboard, they found the crew dead, their bodies covered in dark, hideous swellings. The year was 1349, and the Black Death had arrived in the heart of the Hanseatic world. This was not merely a plague, it was a scythe that swept across Europe, cutting down perhaps half of the entire population. But for the merchants of the Hanseatic League, the staggering death toll was only the beginning of the catastrophe. The real upheaval was economic, a fundamental rewriting of the rules that had made them rich. The intricate supply chains they had built, which depended on a vast pool of cheap labor, suddenly snapped. In the forests of Russia, there were fewer hunters to trap the precious sable. In the mines of Germany, there were fewer men to dig for silver. In the shipyards, the master carpenters who knew how to build a cog died, taking their skills with them. The League's greatest strength, its mastery of bulk commodities, became its greatest liability. How do you profit from a cargo of timber when there is no one left to cut the trees and no one left to buy the planks? The old economic order was inverted overnight. With so many workers dead, those who survived found their labor was suddenly a scarce and valuable commodity. A common dockworker or a farmhand who had once lived a life of subsistence could now demand higher wages. For the first time, individual laborers had bargaining power. This surge in labor cost shattered the low-margin, high-volume model that the Hanseatic League had perfected. The price of everything from mining silver to loading a ship skyrocketed, squeezing their profits to a whisper. At the same time, the patterns of consumption transformed. The survivors of the plague, often inheriting the wealth of their dead relatives, developed new tastes. They were less interested in bulk goods like cheap cloth and salt herring. They wanted finer things, luxury items like expensive fabrics, spices, and crafted goods. The market was shifting from quantity to quality, a move that favored nimble, specialized traders over the League's massive, slow-moving cog networks. This new reality demanded flexibility, but the Hanseatic League was an institution built on rigidity. Its entire structure was designed for stability and predictability, for enforcing standardized rules across vast distances. The Diet in Lübeck was ill-equipped to respond to such a rapid, continent-wide economic earthquake. Some member cities, desperate for labor, tried to impose old wage caps, triggering riots and unrest. Others, seeing the new demand for luxuries, began to break ranks and pursue their own independent deals, undermining the collective bargaining power that was the League's soul. The plague had not just killed people, it had killed the old certainties. The Hanseatic League now faced a world where its workers had power, its customers had new desires, and its own members were beginning to question the value of their alliance. How could a network founded on collective discipline possibly hold together when the very concept of a collective had been so brutally fractured? The very alliance that had once dictated terms to kings began to consume itself from within. A ghost of disunity haunted the grand halls where merchants once spoke with a single voice. The deepest cracks appeared not from an external enemy, but from the rising ambitions of its most powerful members. Cologne, the great mercantile hub on the Rhine, began to chafe under the leadership of Lübeck. The city fathers of Cologne saw themselves as equals, not subordinates to the Queen of the Hanse. Their trade routes ran south to Italy and the Mediterranean, a world of spices and luxury goods that felt far removed from Lübeck's focus on Baltic fish and Russian furs. When Lübeck's Diet issued a decree for a collective trade embargo against Flanders, Cologne hesitated. Why should its merchants sacrifice their profitable Italian silk trade to support a dispute over wool tariffs that primarily concerned the northern cities? This was not a simple disagreement. It was a fundamental clash of self-interest. Cologne's merchants quietly continued their dealings with Flanders, shattering the League's prized unity and making a mockery of the embargo. The Verhandlung, their ultimate weapon, was shown to be hollow when their own members refused to comply. This was a betrayal that silver could not mend. How can you present a united front to the world when your own partners are secretly cutting deals behind your back? The problem of collective defense became even more paralyzing. When pirates infested the shipping lanes of the North Sea, the call went out from Lübeck for a coordinated naval patrol. The response was a chorus of excuses. Smaller towns along the Baltic coast, their treasuries thin, questioned why they should fund the protection of ships from wealthier cities. Why should Rostock pay to safeguard a cargo owned by a Hamburg merchant? Each city council calculated the cost against its own narrow benefit and often decided to let someone else bear the burden. The League had no central treasury to levy taxes, no standing fleet to command. Every joint action required a fresh round of begging and negotiation. a slow, grinding process that gave pirates and rival kingdoms all the time they needed to exploit their hesitation. The Diet itself became a theater of simmering resentment. Delegates from Danzig, grown rich on the grain trade with Poland, saw little reason to follow directives from Lübeck that served Lübeck's interests first. The League's greatest strength, its decentralized nature, had become its terminal illness. It was a federation with no mechanism to enforce its own will upon its members. The bonds of mutual profit, once so strong, had frayed into 1,000 threads of individual ambition. If a shared enemy like King Valdemar could forge unity, then the quiet peace of prosperity dissolved it. What happens to a network when every node decides it is the center of the web? There was no single thunderclap that announced the end of the Hanseatic League. Empires built on commerce do not shatter, they erode grain by grain like a sandstone cliff facing a relentless sea. The 16th and 17th centuries were this slow, inexorable tide, and the League was simply unwilling to move to higher ground. The old world, a patchwork of local lords and city alliances, was hardening into something new and formidable, the nation-state. Kings in London, Copenhagen, and Stockholm were no longer just powerful men. They were the embodiments of centralized nations with permanent bureaucracies, professional armies, and navies funded by national taxes. They looked upon the Hanseatic League not as a partner, but as an archaic corporation operating without a charter in their newly sovereign waters. Why should a foreign merchant guild enjoy special privileges when a strong national merchant marine could keep the profits at home? One by one, the treaties that were the League's lifeblood were revoked or simply ignored. The contours, those proud islands of foreign privilege, became expensive anachronisms. The Steelyard in London was finally confiscated by Queen Elizabeth I, its walls no longer a shield but a prison for a dying way of life. The League's response to this existential threat was not adaptation, but a stubborn retreat into nostalgia. The merchant councils, dominated by aging, conservative burghers, clung to the old ways with a death grip. Their answer to the revolutionary Dutch flight was to issue regulations demanding that all Hanseatic cogs be built to the traditional, expensive specifications. They tried to enforce trade embargoes that their own members no longer respected. While the world was rushing toward the future, the Hanseatic Diet was busy polishing the furniture on a sinking ship. This institutional paralysis was compounded by a geographical earthquake. The center of global commerce was shifting irrevocably from the enclosed Baltic to the vast, open Atlantic. New sea routes around Africa and to the Americas brought spices, silver, and sugar directly to western ports, making the League's overland portages and eastern fur trade seem provincial and quaint. The wealth of the world was no longer flowing through Lübeck, it was sailing past it into the harbors of Amsterdam and London. The final act came not with a bang but with a whisper. In 1669, a final diet was convened. Where once hundreds of delegates from dozens of cities had filled the hall, now only a handful of representatives from 9 cities bothered to attend. The agenda was not about confronting kings or launching fleets, but about managing the dissolution of their shared debts and the maintenance of a few lighthouses. There were no grand pronouncements, no declarations of an end. The delegates simply finished their business, closed their ledgers, and went home. The Hanseatic League, the empire that had commanded kings, did not collapse. It adjourned forever, leaving an empty chamber where the ghost of a commercial revolution once lived. The silence in those abandoned contours did not last forever. Centuries later, the scrape of an archaeologist's trowel would begin to answer the questions the merchants left behind. Beneath the modern streets of London, along the Victoria Embankment, lie the ghostly foundations of the Steelyard. Excavations have revealed more than just the outlines of warehouses. They have uncovered the physical truth of the Hanseatic Diet's power, a deep layer of crushed oyster shells. This was not a feast but a currency. The shells were ballast brought in by cogs from the Baltic, and they were used to stabilize the swampy ground of the Thames bank, creating a solid foundation for the massive scales and stone cellars that held the League's wealth. Each shell is a tiny piece of a logistical puzzle, a testament to the sheer volume of goods that passed through this foreign enclave. Far to the east, in Novgorod, the waterlogged soil performed a different kind of magic, preserving what fire and time usually destroy. Here, archaeologists have peeled back the layers to find a perfectly preserved medieval street, complete with wooden plumbing and the very timber walls of St. Peter's Yard, but the most telling finds are not the buildings, but the small, personal objects lost between the floorboards. A merchant's seal carved from bone, used to stamp his signature onto wax and authenticate a contract. Fragments of wax tablets, the reusable notebooks of the era, still bearing the faint grooves of calculations for the price of fur or the interest on a loan. A single leather shoe, perfectly preserved, tells a story not of grand diplomacy, but of a merchant pacing the yard waiting for a ship. These artifacts transform the rigid rules of the scrawl from a historical text into a lived reality. They show us the individual faces behind the corporate entity, men who worried about their accounts, who lost their personal seals, and who walked the same wooden planks day after day. The story of the League's end is written just as clearly in the dirt. In the final layers of these sites, the quality of the finds changes. The intricate merchant seals are replaced by simpler, cruder items. The layers of imported luxury goods thin out, replaced by more local, cheaper products. Then comes a layer of ash and charred timber in some outposts, evidence of a final, destructive fire, perhaps from a raid or an accident that no one had the wealth or will to rebuild. In others, there is no dramatic destruction, only a gradual decline in the artifacts, a slow fading away until the site is simply abandoned, the roofs caving in, the yards filling with silt. The archaeology does not show a sudden collapse. It reveals a slow leak, a gradual loss of economic pressure until the vibrant, noisy world of the contour was finally and utterly silent. What can these silent stones and lost objects tell us about the world that replaced them? A world the Hanseatic League could never have imagined. That deserted contour in Novgorod and our own globalized world are not so far apart. The ghostly trade routes of the Hanseatic League have simply been rewired with fiber optic cables. Think of their network of contours, those fortified trading posts from London to Russia. They were the medieval equivalent of a multinational corporation's overseas headquarters. A merchant from Lübeck could travel to the Steelyard in London or St. Peter's Yard in Novgorod and find a familiar corporate culture, the same commercial laws, and a trusted system of accounts. This is not so different from a modern executive flying from a New York office to a Singapore branch, where the same corporate logo hangs in the lobby and the same software manages the supply chain. The Hanseatics perfected the art of operating a seamless, standardized business across vast distances and different cultures. Their revolutionary trade agreements, which secured tax exemptions and legal autonomy in foreign cities, were the precursors to today's free trade zones. Places like the Steelyard, where goods could be stored and sold under special economic rules, functioned just like a modern special economic zone in Dubai or Shanghai, designed to attract foreign investment and streamline commerce by cutting through local red tape. Even their greatest innovation, the development and enforcement of a common commercial law, echoes in our international business courts and standardized contracts like Incoterms. The Hanseatic League created a legal framework that allowed a merchant in Bruges to confidently do business with a shipmaster in Danzig, because both understood the rules governing delivery, payment, and liability. This was a private, merchant-created system of order that transcended the messy patchwork of local kingdoms, much like how international arbitration today resolves disputes between companies from different nations outside of any single country's legal system. They were, in essence, the original architects of globalization. They proved that economic power could flow through networks, not just through empires, and that trust, built on a foundation of predictable rules and mutual profit, could be a more powerful currency than royal decrees. Their story forces us to ask a profound question. In our own interconnected world of just-in-time delivery and global supply chains, are we merely living in the most recent chapter of a story that these medieval merchants began writing over 700 years ago? The word pirate conjures images of swashbuckling adventurers, but for a Hanseatic merchant, it meant only a threat to his livelihood. The League did not employ pirates, they waged a constant, expensive war against them. Victuallers, the privateers of the North Sea, were their nemesis, licensed by rival powers to prey on Hanseatic shipping under the thin guise of legality. The League's response was not a shadowy fleet of its own, but a very public and practical one, funding coastal patrols and even establishing a formal insurance fund to reimburse merchants for cargo lost to piracy. This was a business fighting a business, not a secret society commanding the seas. The myth of their absolute monopoly is equally misleading. They did not blockade ports and strong-arm competitors into submission. Their control was secured through the very treaties we have already discussed, legally granted privileges that gave them exclusive access to certain markets and goods. A king would grant the Hanse a monopoly on the sale of Scania herring not because he feared their warships, but because he needed their silver and their logistical genius to manage the massive herring fisheries. It was a contractual arrangement, a partnership where the crown traded a trade privilege for a guaranteed revenue stream and a stable food supply for its people. The reality was less about brute force and more about being the most reliable, efficient operator in the room. And what of their secret meetings in candlelit chambers? The Hanseatic Diet was anything but secret. Its decisions were meticulously recorded in town council records across Northern Europe. The problem is not that they were hidden, but that they were profoundly bureaucratic. The true secret was not a conspiracy, but the mind-numbing process of achieving consensus among 70 squabbling cities. Imagine a modern corporate board meeting, but one where every single regional manager has veto power and the meeting is conducted in a dozen different dialects of self-interest. The mystery is not what they decided, but how they ever managed to decide anything at all. Their power did not flow from clandestine pacts, but from the open, grinding, and often dull machinery of collective commerce. So if the Hanseatic League was not a cabal of pirate kings, what was the true source of its legendary power? The answer lies not in shadow, but in something far more mundane and perhaps far more revolutionary. Yet the ghost of the League refused to stay buried in the archives. 7 centuries after its political power faded, the Hanseatic name is experiencing a remarkable rebirth, not as a commercial empire but as a cultural bridge. The city of Lübeck, the old queen herself, decided to send out invitations once more. In 1980, it launched a new alliance officially called the Hanseatic Cities of the New Time. Today, this network includes nearly 200 towns and cities across 16 European countries, all of them former members of the original League. But this is not a revival of trade monopolies or armed cogs. This is a project funded by the European Union, a conscious effort to weave the old Hanseatic geography back together with threads of tourism, cultural exchange, and shared heritage. Why would a 21st century city choose to define itself by a 700-year-old merchant label? The answer lies in the enduring power of a brand that speaks of openness, connectivity, and a shared European identity that predates the modern nation-state. A mayor in Tallinn or Gdansk can invoke the Hanseatic past to instantly communicate a history of internationalism and economic savvy, qualities that attract tourists and investors alike. They are not just selling a historical footnote, they are selling an authentic pan-European story. This modern Hanse organizes medieval festivals, student exchanges, and museum collaborations. A tourist can follow a Hanseatic route from Bruges to Bergen, walking through restored brick Gothic town centers that feel strangely familiar, united by a common architectural DNA. This new league creates a framework for mayors to discuss common problems, from preserving historic city centers to managing sustainable tourism, issues that their medieval predecessors would have understood perfectly. The project proves that the League's most valuable export was not salt or furs, but an idea, the idea that cities, when they cooperate, can create a network more resilient and influential than any single one could be alone. In a Europe sometimes fractured by national politics, this Hanseatic revival offers a different model of unity, one built from the ground up, from the cobblestone streets of its ancient member cities. It asks a quiet but profound question: if the original League could build an empire with cogs and contracts, what could its spiritual successors achieve with high-speed rail and digital networks? The legacy is no longer about controlling trade, but about remembering that our destinies have always been interconnected. The Hanseatic League's journey is a story of transformation, from a simple pact for safe passage into a force that bent the very shape of Europe. It began as a practical solution to the chaos of shattered kingdoms and pirate-infested seas, a cooperative of merchants who realized their collective strength far surpassed their individual power. This alliance of towns, bound by mutual profit rather than royal blood, grew to command economies, defeat kings, and dictate the succession of monarchs. It became a medieval superpower, an empire without an emperor, whose cultural and legal footprint still echoes in our cities and our commerce. Yet its fall carries a warning as potent as its rise. The League's story teaches us that cooperation can build empires, but rigidity will inevitably break them. Its decentralized structure, a source of incredible flexibility and resilience in its youth, became a cage of parochial self-interest in its old age. It could not adapt to the rise of the nation-state, the shift in global trade routes, or the revolutionary efficiency of its competitors. It was a system perfectly designed for a world that was rapidly disappearing. The forces that dismantled it were not swords and sieges, but the relentless currents of economic change, national ambition, and a failure to innovate. The ghost of this merchant network invites us to look at our own interconnected world and ask what fragile alliances we depend on and what certainties we cling to that may already be fading. The stones of Lübeck, Tallinn, or Bruges still hold their secrets. To walk those cobbled streets, to stand in the shadow of a massive brick Gothic warehouse, is to walk in the footsteps of the merchant kings. It is to feel the scale of their ambition and to understand the quiet, pragmatic power of a handshake that once built a world. The League's true legacy is not just in the history books, but waiting for you to discover it for yourself, etched into the very fabric of these cities that once commanded the seas.